Hello. Welcome. Welcome to Knesset Israel. For those in the room, very excited to have you here, and also welcome to those of you joining us on live stream. I'm Rabbi Becca Walker. I'm Director of Lifelong Learning here at Knesset Israel. And a few logistics before I introduce our speaker that we're so excited to have with us today. First, please, if you haven't already, silence your cell phones. And now you can ignore the rest of what I'm saying. Okay, so silence your cell phones. Second, I know that many of you might not have been here to Knesset Israel before, so we're really happy to have you. If you need a restroom, there's out in the hallway, so if you go out these doors and you take a left, you'll see the men's room and the women's room. There's also a single stall bathroom kind of right through this wall. So if you go out the door and take a right. A big thank you to OLLI for partnering with us for this event, to Carol and Judith for all their help. Also, thank you to the Jewish Federation of the Berkshires for being a co-sponsor. And I would also be remiss if I did not mention Naomi Schwartz, who has been a huge force in making this event happen today. So thank you. So you know what to expect. Today's talk will begin with Ambassador Eizenstat giving some introductory remarks to his book, The Art of Diplomacy, along with some slides. Then we will transition into an interview where I will be asking the ambassador some questions about his book. And last, we will have some time for Q&A from the audience. And I apologize in advance, as we likely won't be able to get to everyone's questions, but we'll get to some. And then afterwards, Ambassador Eizenstat has generously agreed to sign books as well. So if you've gotten a book, you will be able to get that signed. And I am honored to be able to introduce our speaker today. Stuart Eizenstat has served as Chief White House Domestic Policy Advisor to President Jimmy Carter. In the Clinton administration, he served as U.S. Ambassador to the European Union, Undersecretary of Commerce, Undersecretary of State, and Deputy Secretary of the Treasury. He was Special Representative of the President and Secretary of State on Holocaust issues, with continuing responsibility on Holocaust issues in the Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations. In addition to his last book, to this most recent book, he is also the author of President Carter, The White House Years, and also The Future of the Jews, How Global Forces Are Impacting the Jewish People, Israel, and Its Relationship with the United States, along with Imperfect Justice, Looted Assets, Slave Labor, and the Unfinished Business of World War II. He is an international lawyer in D.C. and serves as chairman of the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum Council, appointed by President Joe Biden. Please join me in welcoming Stuart Eizenstat.
Thank you, Becca. I want to just start by saying that I feel very much at home in the synagogue. It's one to which I have gone many times, visiting my wonderful sister-in-law, Naomi Schwartz, who's here, and her kids, Marvin and Edith. And it's nice to be on the bima and not listening in the audience, but really I feel very much at home. I also want to recognize my partner, Marianne Lewin, who we believe is one of the only, and perhaps the only, surviving twin, along with her brother, from the Holocaust, from Bergen-Belsen. Rabbi Becca mentioned you, Rabbi David Weiner, Carol Allman Morton from OLLI, and Rabbi Daveen Litwin, the Jewish Federation of the Berkshires, all of whom have sponsored this wonderful evening. And thank you all. There are many friends in the audience. I won't mention all of them, or I would take all of my time. I wrote this book for three reasons. First, at a time of great turbulence, when we have seemingly insoluble problems, I wanted to show how, with U.S. leadership over the last 50 years, we solved equally challenging problems and can do so again. Second, with hot wars going on now in Gaza and Ukraine, a potential war in Taiwan, and many wars from Vietnam through Libya in our own lifetimes, I wanted to take a hard look at how, when, and whether U.S. military force can be used as a supplement to diplomacy. And third, at a time of growing isolationism, which I think is as dangerous as we saw between World War I and World War II, I wanted to show the importance of U.S. leadership in the world. Otherwise, we leave a vacuum that Russia, China, and others with very different values will fill, and we will leave our children and grandchildren with an even more difficult world. The starting point to talk about successful negotiations begins with the President appointing the right negotiator at the right time. It's not a guarantee of success. If the parties are so far apart, for example, Hamas and Israel, on what the end result should be, even the best negotiators have difficulty bridging the gaps. But it's impossible to imagine having the opening to China without Henry Kissinger, the Good Friday Agreement without George Mitchell, the reunification of Germany and NATO without George H.W. Bush and Jim Baker, the Good Friday Agreement. All of these, including the Dayton Accords, which solved the Bosnia War with Richard Holbrooke, depended heavily on the personalities of the key negotiators. And I find in all the agreements that I look at in this book, and I look at a dozen, that there were common skills that the negotiators brought to the negotiating table, even in very disparate types of negotiations. And let me give you examples. First is the ability to understand a historical moment when it comes, to seize it, and to determine that you're going to change the arc of history by grabbing it. A good example is when the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and George H.W. Bush realized that history was going to change. And so he fought very hard to reunite Germany over the opposition of each of our allies, the British, the French, and certainly the Soviets, and to do so within NATO. In fact, Margaret Thatcher, who was then the Prime Minister of the UK, said she loved Germany so much she wanted two of them. A second attribute is courage, not the courage of the battlefield, but the courage to break from the status quo, to break from your own political base, to take stands which may be unpopular at home, but which are critical to success. When Sadat went to Jerusalem, he lost his own prime minister. He lost a second one at Camp David. When the Crown Prince of the United Emirates, just 2 years ago, decided to make peace with Israel, it was highly unpopular in his own country. When Prime Minister Begin agreed at Camp David and then later in Jerusalem to peace with Egypt, it was very unpopular in his own Likud party. All of these showed political courage, which is necessary for success. And another example is in Northern Ireland, what the British and great British understatement called the Troubles, the civil war between the Catholics and Protestants, the Unionists and the Nationalists, which took 3,500 lives and maimed tens of thousands, was resolved because finally the leaders of those communities broke with their own constituencies to say, enough is enough. We have to change this dynamic and live together. A third attribute is high intelligence combined with wisdom and good judgment. Henry Kissinger and Zhou Enlai are perfect examples of that in the opening to China. Another one which may surprise you is the ability simply to listen. That is, to listen to the other side, to put yourself in their shoes. International negotiations are not a poker game. They're not a winner-take-all. It has to be a win-win situation because you're negotiating with another sovereign country. And being able to listen to the other side, to put yourself in their shoes, to have what my former boss when I was Deputy Treasury Secretary, Larry Summers, he called it empathetic unsympathetic empathy. Unsympathetic empathy. It's not that you're sympathetic to the other side, but you understand the other side. And I found this when I was negotiating with the Arab countries. I had a very strong pro-Israel background, but if I couldn't put my shoes in the Palestinian shoes, or in the Egyptian shoes, or the Jordanian shoes, then I wouldn't be an adequate negotiator. Next is developing trust and a personal relationship with your negotiating partner, even when they're very difficult. A good example of that is in the German reunification agreements, which were really stalled until James Baker, who wrote the preface for this book, Henry Kissinger wrote the foreword just before he died. And Baker, at a very critical time, took his Soviet counterpart, Edward Shevardnadze, to his retreat at Jackson Hole, Wyoming. And they spent 3 days together as individuals, talking about their families, their hope for peace for future generations. And that helped break the ice and allow Shevardnadze to oppose his own foreign ministry in supporting a united Germany. Your adversary has to be looked at as a negotiating partner, not someone to be humiliated. Next is creativity, and that's why I call it the art of diplomacy, because you're always going to hit a hard spot, a high wall, which seems impassable. So, for example, in the Good Friday agreements, each of the major political parties, Catholic and Protestant, had their own militias, killing each other, maiming each other, kneecapping each other, including doing so while the negotiations were going on. And a number of the parties said, look, we can't negotiate this way. These militias have to disarm. And George Mitchell knew that that was a step too far. So creatively, he came up with something called the Mitchell Principles, which didn't require them to disarm, but required them to sign an agreement that they would resolve their differences peacefully. And that got over the hump. Next is sheer stamina. With the Olympics coming up, negotiations are like a marathon with a sprint at the end. They last not only days and months, but years. And they always seem to end at 2 or 3 in the morning. So having the stamina, as we would say in vernacular, the koach, to negotiate under tremendous pressure after getting very little sleep is critical. Jimmy Carter got maybe 2 or 3 hours sleep over 13 days at Camp David. The term shuttle diplomacy was given to Henry Kissinger's 2-week shuttling with almost no sleep between Syria, Egypt, and Israel. So stamina is also required. Next, and I'm switching to another sports analogy, and that is baseball. You shouldn't swing just for home runs. You have to go for singles and doubles. What I mean by that is if you try to get too much in agreement, it may collapse of its own weight. An example, in Northern Ireland negotiations, there were 2 major issues. What do you do, as I mentioned, with the arms that the militias have? And second, what's the political future of Northern Ireland? That's what the fight was all about. Is it going to be part of Great Britain, or is it going to be part of the Irish Republic? Neither one was resolved by the Good Friday Agreement. What was resolved is bringing the communities together, breaking literally the wall between them, establishing economic and personal relationships, and to this day, now we're 2024, we're over 20 years afterward, no referendum has been held. It took 9 years after that for Tony Blair to get enough confidence in the parties to disarm the militias. So not trying to get too much will sometimes produce an agreement. Trying to get too much will oftentimes crater them. Next is what we call back channels or track 2 negotiations. And these occur when the 2 parties are so mutually distrustful they literally won't get in the same room with each other. So, for example, the way in which the nuclear agreement in 2015 was reached between Iran and the United States, who were deeply distrustful of each other, is by going through an intermediary, the Sultan of Oman, who had good relations with both. The way in which we got the first hostage deal done with Hamas was not by direct negotiations between Israel and Hamas because of their deep distrust. It was because of back channels that were used with Qatar and with Egypt, with help from the United States as well. So using back channels is critical, and the most beautiful example of that is the 1993 Oslo agreements. My friend Yossi Beilin, who was at that time a junior diplomat, had the idea of trying to bring the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization, and lower level officials together for unofficial negotiations. And they reached a framework which they then gave to Prime Minister Rabin, who literally didn't know about the back channel negotiations. And that enabled Oslo to become a reality. Next is there's always a tendency by whoever is elected president to feel that what his predecessor did is not good. And walking away from what your predecessor has done is a disaster. It leads to a lack of continuity. So let me give you examples on both sides. Ronald Reagan defeated us soundly in 1980. And in the process, he ran against our SALT II nuclear agreement with Russia, the Soviet Union. And yet, once he was elected president, he followed that agreement for all 7 years because he realized that it represented an agreement that the President of the United States had reached, and that it would be worse to abandon it than to keep it. The exact opposite has occurred now twice with Donald Trump. First, he backed away from the nuclear agreement in 2015 with Iran that had its imperfections, but that had boxed in Iran's nuclear agreement program. It reduced the number of centrifuges by 2/3. It reduced their enriched uranium down to civilian grade. It destroyed an entire plutonium plant. And by abandoning that because he didn't like what his predecessor Obama had done, Iran is now broken out of that agreement and is closer to a nuclear weapon than ever. Another example is climate change. I negotiated the Kyoto Protocols in 1998 in Japan. And we are a highly unreliable negotiator on climate change. We're in or out, depending on who wins the last election. When the Republicans are elected, Bush 2, Bush 1, Trump, we pull out. When the Democrats come in, we go in. Well, how can a negotiator for the U.S. ask other countries to do more to reduce their emissions when they say, well, wait a minute, we don't know who's going to win the next election and whether you're going to abide by what you've just agreed to. Last is something we're all used to in our own lives when we negotiate with our spouses, our partners, our kids, our business associates, and that's leverage. Leverage is crucial to negotiations. And in international negotiations, there are two types of leverage. There's positive leverage, for example, opening our market to foreign goods as an inducement of getting a country to agree. The reason that we ended up with the Abraham Accord with the UAE and Israel in part was because President Trump, and I think wisely, agreed to sell F-35 fighter jets to the UAE, something they really wanted. It was a positive incentive. The negative incentives are economic sanctions, and we do more of them than any combined country in the world. They're of decreasing value now when we don't have monopolies. The threat of force, as President Clinton used in Haiti in 1994, when we literally had our aircraft flying to Haiti to get a dictator out and the elected official back in. And the ultimate leverage, and that is military force. And a third of my book is devoted to the whole question of military force. And let me conclude my opening remarks with just a few lessons to be learned from military force. And this will lead into Gaza and Ukraine and other things I'm sure you'll be interested in. The lessons on military force. When do you use military force? I have served with presidents. It's the most difficult decision a president can make. Putting young men and women in the object of really being in the battlefield, risking their lives, risking their futures, destroying families. It's a tremendously difficult decision. So when do you use it? And it can be a useful device for negative leverage to get an agreement. First, it should be the last option after you've tried everything else. After negotiations have failed, after economic sanctions have failed, after the threat of military force has failed. Second, it has to be in the supreme national interest of the United States, something that's really critical. There are lots of things that go on in this world, in the Congo and elsewhere, that are terrible. But a president has to say, is it really in our own national interest to have U.S. troops on the battle line? Third, and this is something when we get into Gaza that we can talk about, but I want to mention it here, and that is before the first bullet is fired, to have a political plan in place the day after the war is going to end. To know that you can put something in place that's better than the government you're trying to get rid of. So Steve Hadley and Condoleezza Rice, Steve Hadley was the National Security Advisor, Condoleezza Rice was Secretary of State to George W. Bush, Bush II. And this is when they deposed Saddam Hussein. And in one of the 130 interviews I did for this book, he said, Stu, the big mistake we made, and I want to be honest about it, is that we tried to depose Saddam Hussein without knowing what the consequences were going to be of deposing a minority Sunni leader, Saddam Hussein, in a majority Shiite country. And that caused the whole civil war with a lot of other mistakes that were made. Think first, and this is something that today, we're July 18th, 2024, we're in the 9th month of the Gaza war, and there is still no Israeli plan for the day after. There wasn't when the first bullet was fired, and there isn't today. That's a terrible mistake. Secretary of Defense Gates said, we overestimated the capacity of military force to change politics on the ground. Next, if you're going to invade, for goodness sakes, understand the culture, the history, the politics of the country you're invading. And both in Iraq and in Afghanistan, we didn't. General Petraeus, who ended up turning around the Second Iraq War, said to me in his interview that we made the mistake of intervening in a country we didn't understand. Yes, we have a supreme military force, but we're dealing with a country that has its own history, and we have to understand it. Next, if you're going to use military force, know what the barriers to success are, the costs, because it never succeeds the way you plan it on paper. Mike Tyson, the former heavyweight champion, once said, every plan looks great until you get into the ring and somebody hits you in the nose. And that's what happens in wartime. So, for example, in the Second Iraq War, and Second Kosovo War in 1999, we mistakenly hit the Chinese embassy in Belgrade. To this day, they believe that it was done purposely. It was not done purposely, but you have to take into account that wars are going to always have mistakes. And last, and most important, is to have good intelligence on the enemy before you go in. So we went into Iraq, we deposed Saddam Hussein on the notion that our intelligence said that they had weapons of mass destruction. Well, the fact is, he did have weapons of mass destruction, and what I learned in this book, in my interviews, is He did have weapons of mass destruction, but he had destroyed them before we invaded in line with UN resolutions. Well, if that's the case, why didn't he say so and save his own life and thousands of other young men and women? Because he was afraid if he admitted that he had destroyed his weapons of mass destruction, it would have weakened it at home and encouraged Iran to go and invade. And on that terrible intelligence, so many lives were lost. I was subject, myself personally, in the Carter administration, to one of the worst intelligence failures in American history. And that is 6 weeks before the Shah of Iran was forcibly deposed, the CIA sent us an internal analysis saying that Iran is in neither a revolutionary nor even a pre-revolutionary state, that the Shah is politically strong. A terrible mistake. And all the decisions that were made based on that led to his being deposed and to the Iranian Revolution. The last is the issue of force. If you're going to use force, Colin Powell said it has to be decisive force. So in the first Iraq War with George H.W. Bush, 500,000 troops, a UN resolution, 38 countries, decisive force. His son, 12 years later, didn't listen to his father. And what he did is used what his own Secretary of Defense, Don Rumsfeld, called a light footprint. And he divided our forces between Iraq and Afghanistan, neither one of which was decisive enough to do the job. Now, having said that, I'll close and take Becca's questions by saying that diplomacy, properly used, can be a tremendously important institution to bring about peace. But it requires that the United States be strong politically, economically, and militarily, that we speak with one voice when we go abroad. If a negotiator is speaking and he knows that the other side thinks we're divided at home, we're at a disadvantage. We have to remember that the strongest party doesn't always win the fight. We lost the Vietnam War, although we were militarily stronger. We lost the war in Afghanistan, although we were militarily stronger. The Taliban had a beautiful proverb. They said, "You have the watches, we have the time. We know you're going to get out." So these are lessons to be learned. If properly used again, diplomacy can and must be a way of making this a better world. Thanks, and I'll be glad to take Becca's questions. So we're going to do a little root canal here on the stage.
Yeah, set change. Take this.
Just step over there. Maybe step right down there.
We're going to leave the chairs up there because we don't see. Can you test that microphone? Is that one working?
You want me to take it off?
Is it working, the microphone?
I think so.
You can hear it? Well, thank you for that introduction. A lot to think about and lots of questions were raised. So firstly, you spoke a little bit in your introduction and also in your book about the art of diplomacy and what makes it an art. And you spoke to us a little bit about what makes a successful negotiator. And you say that great negotiators aren't born, but are developed through hard work and experience. So could you tell us a little more about your journey as a negotiator and what helped you develop some of those traits you spoke about?
So interestingly, the State Department has something in Northern Virginia called the Foreign Service Institute. And this is where our foreign service officers, before they're sent abroad, go for language training, go to train on the culture.
I think this needs to come up a little bit. Someone else is saying can't hear.
Can you hear now? Okay. So the Foreign Service Institute trains our diplomats, our foreign service officers, before they go abroad in the language of the country they're going to, the culture. They don't train them on negotiating skills, and yet that's what they're called upon to do. So mine came through the following process. First, when I was President Carter's Chief Domestic Advisor, negotiating with the Congress and members of Congress on legislation, like energy, for example, or the Department of Education. I learned very quickly that you don't lecture a member of Congress on what he or she should do just because we propose something. You have to listen and understand what they need to bring back to their constituents. Somebody in Texas has a very different view on the deregulation of natural gas than somebody in Massachusetts. And so the ability to listen is something I learned in the White House. Second, when I was ambassador to the European Union in Brussels, I had the good fortune of having a tremendously capable group of foreign service officers, particularly my second in command, called the Deputy Chief of Mission, Tony Wayne. And he really taught me lessons about how to negotiate with the European Union, how to listen, how to put myself in their shoes and understand what they needed for a successful negotiation. And third, it was sort of being thrown in the lake and having to swim when I was unexpectedly asked to do two negotiations. One, the Kyoto negotiations, with only 3 weeks preparation with 190 countries, and an incredibly complex set of negotiations where I had to prepare. And I learned the importance of preparation. And then after Kyoto, the Holocaust negotiations were also ones that were important. Let me give you a good example of in preparation and why preparation is important. It's like homework you do as kids in school. You have to know more about the issues than anyone else at the table. Example, we're in the 13th day at Camp David between Begin and Sadat and their teams. And Begin comes to the president and he says, Mr. President, I am not going to compromise anymore. I want you to get a limousine to take me to Andrews Air Force Base. I've got an El Al plane waiting to take me home. I'm not going to negotiate any further. Carter realizes that this could totally undermine Sadat's historic trip to Jerusalem, where he pledged no more wars, could lead to his assassination, could lead to the collapse of Carter's own government. And he remembered from his preparation of reading studiously the CIA profiles of Sadat and Begin that Begin had a great love for his 8 grandchildren. And so he got his personal secretary, Susan Clow, to get the names of each of Begin's personal grandchildren, personalize the inscription to each one with hopes for peace, Jimmy Carter, walk them over to Begin's cabin at Camp David, handed it to them, and heard Begin vocalize the name of each of his grandchildren, saw tears come in Begin's eyes, his lips quiver. He put his bags down and he said, Mr. President, for my grandchildren, I'll make one last stab. And that ended up solving the problem. One other humorous conclusion to that is that under the Camp David Accords, which were not legally binding, they were a framework. It called on Egypt and Israel within 3 months to have a binding treaty. Well, 3 months passed, 4 months passed, 5 months passed. We're in our 6th month, no treaty. So Carter, over the objection of all, this is political courage, over all of his advisors, goes to Jerusalem and Cairo and shuttles for 3 days. The 3 days are over, no agreement. Air Force One is refueled. Everybody's going back to Ben Gurion Airport to leave. Carter's changing into his jeans. and Begin suddenly calls and says, I'd like to see the president one last time. And we thought, well, he's just calling to say thanks for coming. I'm sorry it didn't work. So Carter then redresses and puts his tie on because Begin's very formal. And Begin says to us in the lobby, he says, boys, you know, we're in the King David Hotel. This is a very famous hotel. And we say, we know that, Mr. Prime Minister. He says, well, not for the reasons you think. I blew this hotel up when I was head of the Oregon. But don't worry, I'm not going to do it while Carter's here. Well, so he goes up to the presidential suite. That's where the treaty is reached. They come down. The elevator breaks between the first floor and the lobby. The Secret Service had to pull Begin and Carter out butt first, and I call it the breech birth of the treaty.
Wow, that's an amazing story, and really sounds like some of these pieces, these aspects of being a great negotiator were hard earned, and there's some trial by fire there. So you interviewed so many people for this book, really impressive, an impressive list of like who's who in this world. And in this interview process, was there anything you learned that surprised you? And what was it like reliving these situations through other people's eyes?
Well, first, I think one of the surprises was when I put them all together, the commonality of the skills that they all brought. Very different people. I mean, Kissinger is as different from Jim Baker or George Mitchell as you can possibly get. And yet, even though the individuals were different and the situations were vastly different, they brought common skills. So let me give you a perfect example of what I mean by putting yourself in the other person's shoes. So let's go back, and this is why Kissinger is such an incredible negotiator. Let's go back to the 73 Yom Kippur War. Surprised Israel on Yom Kippur. Israel was literally on its heels. And through help with Nixon and Kissinger and their own fortitude, they begin to turn the battle around, and they go on the offensive. And they have surrounded in the Egyptian Sinai the whole Egyptian Third Army, which is the core of Sadat's army. They literally had them by the throat. They could have destroyed the entire Third Army. And what does Kissinger do? He goes to Golda Meir and he says, you mustn't destroy the Third Army. And she says, what are you talking about? We've lost hundreds of men and women with their surprise attack. They fought us in 4 wars already. He says, I'm telling you from my knowledge of Sadat, he's ready for peace. But if you humiliate him, if you destroy his army, you'll never have peace. If, on the other hand, you keep that army and we build in protections in the Sinai through sensors and through having men stationed there who are, by the way, still there. We still have forces in the mountain passes in the Sinai to this day. Then we can have peace. So he put himself and tried to put Golda in Sadat's own shoes. And that was really one of the genius acts of diplomacy.
So to kind of follow up an addendum to this question is, as you're learning all these things from your interviews, did you have a favorite person to interview? Or to be more diplomatic, was one of your interviews where you learned the most from?
Well, I mean, I have to say that I guess there were 4. One was President Carter himself, and I want to say that whatever imperfections there were in the administration, and I've written a book, a 900-page book. This book, don't worry, is only about a third of that size. But I know all the imperfections, pluses and minuses of the administration. But what happened at Camp David was without exception the greatest personal presidential involvement in negotiations in American history, more than Woodrow Wilson in Paris in World War I. It was exceptional. 22 drafts of negotiations he personally did, 22. And he personalized things. So, for example, he had Shabbat dinner at an all-kosher kitchen that was kosher at Camp David and had a Shabbat dinner with the Israeli delegation. He took Begin and Sadat in his presidential limousine to Gettysburg Battlefield, which is very close to Camp David, to show them the folly of more wars. That had two humorous outcomes. One was Sadat was a general. He had actually studied in the United States. He knew all the mistakes the Confederates made, including Pickett's charge at Gettysburg, and mentioned them to Carter, who as a Southerner was sort of chagrined to learn about all the mistakes. But for Begin was not a military man at all. But what Gettysburg did for Begin is on the spot, verbatim, without any notes, he gave the Gettysburg Address. It was an effort to break down the barriers, and that was terrific. I mentioned already Jim Baker taking Shevardnadze to Wyoming, which was a masterpiece of diplomacy. If they had just negotiated in a formal setting with all of their officials, it would have never worked. So those are two beautiful examples. A third example is actually George H.W. Bush, who's a very underrated one-term president. So the Berlin Wall falls, 1989. No one expected it. No one. It was a miscommunication to a border guard. The wall falls, and all of Bush's political advisors say, Mr. President, this is fantastic. What a political boon. You need to go to Berlin and dance on this wall and show what freedom has done. And he said, no, that will humiliate Gorbachev. If I do that, I'll never be able to convince him that Germany, East and West, ought to be reunited. So it's that kind of insight which I think was tremendously important and which I think really was a critical factor. And one last one is on the opening to China. So Kissinger said to me, you know, when I negotiate with the Soviets, they've got a set agenda. We go 1, 2, 3, 4. We lay out our positions. And he said, I was prepared to do that with Zhou Enlai. And then he says, I learned something about negotiating with the Chinese. You don't negotiate that way. Zhou Enlai wanted him to see the Forbidden City. He wanted to talk about Chinese history. And Kissinger understood that you oftentimes have to negotiate with different countries based on their own mentalities, their own history. And that's the kind of insight, again, that great negotiators can bring to the table.
Wow, thank you. So your book covers a great amount of and variety of diplomatic situations. You've grouped into 4 categories in your book, as you know: U.S. and national security, U.S. as mediator, U.S. at war, and U.S. in multilateral negotiations. How did you choose which situations to cover, and are there any you wanted to cover but couldn't?
I chose the ones that I thought had the greatest impact nationally and internationally. And some would surprise you. I mean, for example, I have one chapter called Unsung Heroes, and it talks about how my friend Bernie Aronson solved the 50-year war between the FARC rebels and Colombia, how Chet Crocker solved the problem in Southwest Africa between Cuban troops and South African troops. So some seemed to be less important, but they were really very important. But I also wanted to look at ones that failed, as well as ones that succeeded. So, for example, I've already mentioned Iraq, where we thought they were weapons of mass destruction and made a mistake. But we made additional mistakes. We sent over a very bright young man named Jerry Bremer to be the first counsel ruling over post-Saddam Iraq. He puts out 2 orders. Order number 1, based, by the way, this will interest all of you based on this audience and where we're speaking, based on the denazification of Germany after World War II. So decision number one was that anyone who belonged to the Ba'ath Party, substitute Nazi party, of Saddam would lose their jobs. Well, it seems reasonable, except that no one could get a job in the public sector, including teachers, unless they joined the Ba'ath Party. It didn't mean they liked Saddam. And so we stripped the whole infrastructure of their government. And second, and equally severe, and this was again taken from denazification, we basically dismembered Saddam's entire army. Not just the top levels, but everyone. And we sent them home with their guns, but with no pay. And what did they do? They joined the militias, and that's where the Civil War started. So those kinds of mistakes that are made because we don't understand the countries can have devastating and continuing ramifications. Another mistake, and I already mentioned the intelligence failure that we had with the Shah of Iran. The CIA didn't know that the Shah of Iran, our principal ally for 6 presidents, had incurable cancer. They didn't know that. But our negotiations for the hostage crisis lacked 2 things: leverage and understanding. Leverage because I had recommended in the first National Security Council meeting we had after the hostages were taken that we should do what President Kennedy did in the Cuban Missile Crisis, and we should man the harbors of what's called Karg Island off of Iran, where 60% of their oil comes from, to show force. And the president said, I'm afraid if we do that, they'll assassinate all the hostages. And my counter was, no, Khomeini will never do that. He's still weak. He knows that will bring on World War III, but that is why we didn't do it. So no leverage. We didn't get our own allies to really help cut off Iranian oil. But the other reason was we were negotiating with people who weren't empowered by the supreme leader Khomeini to make agreements. We had agreements. We had several agreements, but not with people who really could speak for the government. So when you're negotiating, particularly with a government like that, and this is going to be a real problem with Hamas and what succeeds, is you have to negotiate with people who have the authority to reach an agreement.
Thank you. So since we're here in a synagogue, and I'm a rabbi, I have to ask a little bit about your Jewish heritage. Is there anything about your Jewish heritage or Jewish upbringing that you feel like brought to the table as you did your negotiations? And were there times that felt like an advantage or a disadvantage?
So, I mean, I grew up in a very Jewish household. Tikkun olam, or repairing the holes in the blanket of the world, was a very important precept, and that has driven my entire public service. But let me give you a personalized example of why it was helpful, and then examples of where it caused complications. So on the positive side, in 1968, after a year in the Johnson White House, I was working on Hubert Humphrey's presidential campaign against Richard Nixon. And when you work on Democratic presidential campaigns, you have to be prepared to lose a lot more than you win. And we lost that one. But it had a formative impact on me, because in that campaign, and I was all of 25 years old, I met someone named Arthur Morse, M-O-R-S-E. You can Google this. And Arthur Morse wrote a path-breaking book in 1968 called While 6 Million Died. And it was the first expose of what FDR and his administration knew about the genocide of the Jews and failed to act on. And it was a shock to me because, as I'm sure it was in your households growing up, I mean, Roosevelt was an icon. And I literally pledged to myself at that time, at the age of 25, that if I ever had a chance to repair this, remove this cloud from the otherwise glorious history of the U.S. in winning World War II, I would do it. And that's what led me down the path of my Holocaust negotiations. So that's why in the Carter administration I recommended that the president create a presidential commission on the Holocaust, which led to the Holocaust Museum. And it's why in the Clinton administration, when I was in Brussels, I got a call from Richard Holbrooke, the guy who negotiated the Dayton Accords. He was Assistant Secretary of Europe. And he says, President Clinton has just met with Edgar Bronfman, the President of the World Jewish Congress, and communism has collapsed, and the tiny emerging Jewish communities of Central and Eastern Europe and the former Soviet Union can finally practice their religion after the twin tragedies of Nazism and communism. But they need the physical infrastructure. They need their synagogues, their cemeteries, their day schools, their community centers, and so forth. And the president would like you to take this responsibility on. And my entire staff at the European Union mission, the U.S. mission to the EU, said, you can't do this. You've got a full-time job as U.S. ambassador. You can't take this secondary responsibility on. And I went back home. I talked to my late wife, Fran, and she said, remember the promise you made to Arthur Morse. And I took it. Holbrooke said, it'll only take 3 months. I'm now in my 20th year of doing it. We've got $9 billion, actually $17 billion of recoveries. But that was an example where Jewish values. Now, the other side of the story was when I was doing Middle East negotiations. So, for example, with Arafat, almost half a dozen times between 1997 and 2000. He obviously knew I was Jewish. He knew I had an Israel background. But I had to be fair in those negotiations. And in fact, even in the Holocaust negotiations, I could never have gotten the Swiss banks, the French banks, the German slave labor companies, the Austrian slave labor companies, the European insurers to agree to a settlement if I was just a Jewish advocate. So I had to be able, infused as I was by the need for justice, to step back and look at things from Arafat's standpoint, from the standpoint of the German slave labor companies. So it can cause complications. You're motivated on the one hand, but on the other you have to realize you're not a Jewish representative. You are a representative of the United States of America.
Thank you. Yeah, so much important work to be done there. So for me, one of the most interesting sections of your book was the chapter on Afghanistan. I think partially because September 11th and the war afterwards was a formative piece of my childhood and coming of age that continued well into my adulthood. So there's a personal context for me. And it was striking how wrong things went. You write about the multitudes of shortcomings that cost many, many lives. And this isn't the only time that this has happened. There are plenty of examples throughout your book. It seems like the U.S. has made major blunders. What do you think it is important to consider so that these types of errors aren't repeated?
So let's put ourselves back in 9/11. A major shock, a major catastrophe, and it was clear that al-Qaeda, based in Afghanistan, had been the prime force behind this. But in the emotion behind reacting, a number of major mistakes were made that led to the longest war in American history. The longest war, 20 years we were in Afghanistan. So error number one, and one of the great tragedies, is we sent a CIA team in of about 100 people, and they located Osama bin Laden. They knew exactly where he was, and they asked the commanding general, Tommy Franks, for additional reinforcements to try to get him in the Tora Bora. And Franks turned it down, and we lost the opportunity to get the culprit behind it at the very beginning. Second, we confused the Taliban with Al-Qaeda. We routed Al-Qaeda. Taliban was never a threat to us. They had no international reach, and yet it was, again, the Taliban that we fought for all this time. Third, we tried to create a Western-style democracy in Afghanistan, in a country that was ruled by clans, that had no history of democracy, and that unwillingness to understand the culture of Iran was really a critical factor. And last, again, the lack of good intelligence. One of the reasons why we were unable to defeat the Taliban is because they had an escape route. They had a safe sanctuary in Pakistan. They could just slip over the border when things got hot and regroup. And we couldn't go after Pakistan, even though they were, in effect, an allied country, because most of our military equipment went through Pakistan to get to Afghanistan. So it was a combination of all of those factors, and of course then, at the very end, the exit was done very poorly, not planned well. And one last thing, and this really pertains also to Ukraine. When Secretary Pompeo, who was President Trump's Secretary of State, negotiated the agreement to withdraw U.S. troops by May of 2021 with the Taliban, the government of Afghanistan, for whom we had fought and bled for 20 years, was not in the room. We literally negotiated behind their back, and by the way, so did Henry Kissinger in the Vietnam negotiations with North Korea. With North Vietnam. South Vietnam was not a party to that agreement. And so in both cases, when we left, those governments collapsed. It's critically important with Zelensky. There's going to be an end to this war between Ukraine and Russia. It'll end, as Kissinger said, you can't achieve at the negotiating table what you don't win on the battlefield. And at some point, sooner rather than later, each side, which has really bled severely, including the Russian side, is going to be convinced that they can't achieve anything more on the battlefield, and they have to come to an agreement. But what's really critical is that we not negotiate behind Zelensky's back. We have to let him negotiate. Now, I want to tell you, and I'm saying this in a synagogue, I feel almost religiously about this issue. If we back away, and we are at risk of doing so with the forthcoming election, if we back away from Ukraine, it's going to be a repeat of the Munich Agreement in 1938. We will be sending a signal to Russia, to China, to our allies in the Middle East, that we're not a reliable partner. Now put yourself, and I told you we have to put ourselves in the other person's shoes. Let's put ourselves in Zelensky's shoes, okay? So sometime, probably, I'm guessing the end of next year, he concludes, maybe Putin concludes, we're stalemated. I don't think we're going to have a formal peace treaty. I think we're going to have something like the 1953 Armistice Agreement between North Korea and South Korea, which has lasted peacefully for 70 years. It's not a peace agreement. It's just a permanent ceasefire. And that's why it's so important to build Ukraine up now so they can be in the strongest position to negotiate. Okay, but here's my basic point. There's an old saying, fool me once, shame on you. Fool me twice, shame on me. Well, we've been fooled twice by Putin. 1994, Putin convinced the Ukrainians to give up the third largest nuclear arsenal in the world in return for a commitment not to further invade Ukraine. He violates it in 2014 by taking Crimea. Then he sends what were called the little green men, hidden Russian soldiers without a Russian uniform, into the area where they're fighting right now, the Donbass area in eastern and southern Ukraine. And that war ends with a negotiation, which we, the United States of America, was a party to, as was the UK government, as was Russia and the Ukraine. And what the Minsk 1 and 2 agreements said in 2014 and 2015 was very simple. Permanent ceasefire. You, Russia, will not try to get any more of Ukraine back. This was 2014, 2015. Okay, what happens? February 21st, 2022, Putin says publicly, Minsk is no more. And 3 days later, he invades Ukraine and tries to take Kyiv. So you're in Zelensky's shoes, and we, the United States, and depends again on who the president is, says to Zelensky, you need to negotiate a peace agreement. And he says, well, wait a minute. I've already had 2 of these things. How do I know that Putin won't just rest, relax, reload, and reinvade? We're not going to make immediate NATO members where they get a NATO guarantee. So what do? And I think what we have to do is the following. First, we have to do what President Biden just did and what a number of NATO countries are willing to do, and that is have a 10-year military agreement. So we show Putin that we're willing to stand behind Ukraine. And I fear that the presidential elections may undercut that, but that's one thing. Second, we need to have Ukraine as a member, not of NATO, but the European Union. It will be much harder for Putin to invade a member of the European Union. And third, we can think about having NATO trainers in Ukraine. Again, creating some tripwires. But this is going to be a very, very difficult negotiation.
I think most of the people in this room are not diplomats. I might be wrong, but I think we are. I'll speak for myself. How can we, as non-diplomats, affect change in this arena? Or is it even possible to affect change around foreign policy as a member of the public?
Well, I mean, I think one thing is, and this may seem trite, but we do live in a democracy. And I think Ukraine being a good example, if people make it clear to their members of Congress, and it, after all, a Republican Speaker of the House, it took him 6 months to do, but he countered a very isolationist group in the Freedom Caucus, and he did the right thing. So we, as part of the public, need to make it clear that we have to stand behind Ukraine. We have to be informed. We have to let our members know where we stand. Now, I don't want to leave this evening without talking about Gaza, but I'll leave that to people in the audience if you want to do that.
That was going to be my next question, but you want me to wait on that? Okay. Yeah, so just, I know I've been having many conversations with many of you, and just constantly thinking about the heartbreaking situation in Israel and Gaza. And as you've been involved in the past with diplomatic negotiations with Israel and its neighbors, I would be interested in any light you could shed on the situation and your understanding of how this might be able to come to an end.
Well, quite frankly, it's difficult to bring light to an extremely dark situation. But let me give you first a personal example. July 2000, I'm Deputy Secretary of the Treasury, and I'm responsible for the economic dimension of the peace process. Dennis Ross was doing the political part. And I went to Gaza, and we got Congress to pass something called the Qualifying Industrial Zone legislation, which meant that any country, and at that time, this was before the UAE peace, it was Egypt and Jordan and the Palestinian Authority, any country or entity that had a peace agreement with Israel could create an industrial zone And if you had as little as 10% Israeli content in your product, you could ship back to the United States duty-free. So it was a real incentive. So here I am, July 2000, in Gaza, at the Gaza Industrial Estate. And what I saw, and I'm going to use this term, was beautiful. I saw 30 plants, not Israeli plants, Japanese plants, European plants, American plants, Singapore plants, using things like unprocessed Israeli cotton to make finished goods. And I went into one of the plants, and I saw the products being loaded onto a flatbed truck and go right through the Eretz crossing, which you see on TV now, to the airport that we built through the Corps of Engineers for the Gazans. There was one, I'm talking about July 2000 now, I'm not talking about a different eon ago, okay? July 2000, one unarmed Israeli soldier watching this whole operation. Now, one of the things I wish I could say to all of these kids demonstrating on a college campus is a 30-second history. 1947, the UN creates a Jewish state by name and an Arab state by name. The Arabs reject, go to war. Camp David, I've talked about. No Palestinians at Camp David. Not a one. Why? Because we couldn't get the Palestinian leadership to agree to UN Resolution 242, Land for Peace. Camp David II, we're now in 2000 with President Clinton, Prime Minister Barack, and Arafat. Same person I was talking about negotiating with. And they agree to what's called the Clinton parameters. 95%, including Gaza, to go back to the Palestinians for a state. East Jerusalem is a capital. Rejected by Arafat, starts the Second Intifada. 2005, a hard-line Israeli Prime Minister, Ariel Sharon, withdraws every single Israeli soldier in Gaza and 7,000 Israeli settlers forcibly expelled. I wish we could show this video. Every campus in the United States forcibly removing these Israeli settlers. And they left the greenhouses and the light industry for the Palestinians to start rebuilding their state. That's 2005. Hamas wins the election in 2006. 2007, they start rockets instead of roses coming over. 2009, Prime Minister Olmert and the current president of the Palestinian Authority, Abbas, who's now in the 16th year of his 4-year term, and Olmert offers 96% of the West Bank and East Jerusalem and 50,000 Palestinian reunion in Israel rejected. So that has to be part of this history. Now, where are we now? We're in a situation in which, in my opinion, Hamas has to be disabled as a governing and military force, but cannot be defeated. They have a huge intelligence failure. Not only did they have the plan, gliders and all, they had that plan in their hands, but it was not believed that Hamas had the capability of implementing it. And I've had 2 briefings by 2 Israeli generals for an Israeli think tank that Dennis Ross and I co-chair, called the Jewish People's Policy Institute of Jerusalem. And those generals said that under our very eyes, we didn't realize that Hamas had morphed from a terrorist group into a terrorist army with 30 to 40,000 well-trained Iranian reinforced armed soldiers. Now they have been significantly dismantled, but not entirely. And they now have re-embedded themselves as a guerrilla group, and they're not going to be totally removed. So what does Israel need to do? And this is a tough, tough choice, because I can tell you that support for a two-state solution, and we've done polls in Israel, support for a two-state solution, which I still think is the only solution, has virtually evaporated in Israel, even the left. But here's the option, and it is there for the taking. The real security threat to Israel is not Hamas itself. It's Iran, which supports Hamas, which supports Hezbollah, which supports the Houthis in Yemen, which supports Syria, which supports their own militias in Iraq. And the way to combat that existential threat is for Israel to embed itself in a moderate Arab coalition with Arab countries with whom they already have peace agreements, with Jordan, with Egypt, with the UAE, with Bahrain, with Morocco, and soon, in fact, that's really what led to the timing of the attack on October 7th with Saudi Arabia. But there's one condition, and the condition is some resolution of the Palestinian issue. And this the current Israeli government will have nothing of. They've weakened the Palestinian Authority, withheld tax revenues from them at the expense of supporting Hamas. They allowed Qatar to spend $500 million supporting Hamas. They had 18,000 workers coming in from Gaza, some of whom started reporting on where the military facilities were, where the telecommunications facilities were. So it's a tough, tough choice. It doesn't mean a Palestinian state tomorrow. It doesn't mean there can't be conditions on a Palestinian state. But that is one of the conditions. Now, there is and I've seen, Marion and I went to the UAE, and I've gone a second time. There's a real separation, and to Egypt as well, between the leadership in the Arab world, which doesn't give a hoot for the Palestinians, and the so-called Arab street, which does. And even in authoritarian Arab countries, that is a constraint. So these Arab moderate Sunni countries are not demanding a Palestinian state tomorrow, but some glide path to it eventually. And that's going to be the condition of Israel's real security, which means being embedded in that kind of a coalition of which the U.S. will be a major part. Without it, Israel will be alone. It'll be fighting Hamas alone. It'll be looking even on the rebuilding of 80% of Gaza, which is destroyed. That's got to come from the United Arab Emirates, from Saudi Arabia, from Bahrain, from the oil-rich countries. They won't do it unless they can do it in a safe, secure, politically viable situation in which Hamas is not ruling, but which there's someone else who is.
Thank you. Well, a lot to think about there. I want to open it up for a few questions in the audience. So just to give a brief how-to, questions, please, not comments. Please keep it brief. We want to get to as many as we can. And I have a few people are going to run with the microphone. I have 2 microphones, and please say your question into the microphone so everyone here can hear you and everyone on the live stream can hear you. Here's one. I'm going to get you a second.
We read in the news that there were female soldiers who had reported on the strength of Hamas before October 7th. And as you were speaking about all the different events this evening, there's so many times when women weren't listened to, and I'm wondering if in our State Department and if in the White House, whichever one of these administrations, is anybody thinking about or even asking the women, the mothers, the carers about what we're about to do?
So on the Hamas morphing from a terrorist group into a terrorist army, this was missed by Israeli intelligence, by the CIA, by MI6 in the UK, by the German intelligence, by everyone. Now, what wasn't known and was known to Israeli intelligence, and particularly to some of the female intelligence gatherers who you mentioned, and I'm not prepared to say it was a sexist issue, but I'm just saying the reality. The reality is that there were several female analysts in the military and in the Mossad who literally had almost the exact plan for October 7th, and they couldn't push it up high enough in the hierarchy to get it accepted. And they just, the upper levels said, Hamas can't do it, they're just a terrorist group, they don't have this level of organization. And by the way, the head of the Mossad has resigned, effective at the end of the war. But this is a great, great tragedy. There'll be a commission looking at this. We'll know more about it, but it is a fact that it was female analysts who had the plan, put it all together, and couldn't sell it. Yes.
You said that Hamas should, that they're not going to disappear, but they need to be weakened. What organization would you see coming in to replace them or to take over Gaza?
So that's a $64 question. The administration's answer, which I think is the right one, is a reformed, strengthened Palestinian Authority. So when we had the 2006 election, and by the way, the Bush administration, in this whole democratization movement of Iraq and Afghanistan and so forth, wanted elections in Gaza. And the Palestinian Authority and a number of others said, it may be good in the United States, it's not going to be good for us here. And so Hamas won the election, and the rest is history. Now we have to strengthen and reform the Palestinian Authority, which had been in charge of Gaza before. And before that, by the way, Egypt. And so they need to be the institution that takes over. But in the interim, there needs to be some probably UN-based multinational organization that just provides food, medicine, and education and begins the reconstruction of Gaza. I mean, I am not suggesting that economic improvement is the solution to peace, but it's one indispensable ingredient. Let me give you an example. In Iraq, which was going horribly, General Petraeus came in. He told me this in his interview. He was a great man. He turned the whole Iraq war around. And he had 3 simple lessons. Clear an area and keep it. Second, hold it from the terrorists. But third, clear, hold, and build. And he said the build meant convincing non-combatant civilians that life would be better for the next government than following the radical path. And he had in his office, in the deserts of Iraq, a sign that said, this is General Petraeus, that said, "What have you done to help an Iraqi civilian today?" Now, we have to do the same thing with the Gazans. We have to separate those that simply want to live in peace from those who are hardcore Hamas followers. That's extremely difficult to do. It's going to require supreme diplomacy, some kind of multinational military force, but it has to be done. They have to see that there is a better way of life than following the Hamas path. And the polls show, by the way, that after an initial burst of support, that only about 30% of Gazans want Hamas to rule in the future.
Okay, I have a question about your using Henry Kissinger in your book. After his chilling adventure, is you considered a war criminal, Kissinger, and what do you think of Kissinger as a person?
Well, no, I don't consider him a war criminal, and I think he's, I mean, look, there were a lot of things he did with which I strongly disagree. The assassination of Allende, the support of military dictators in Latin America, the bombing of Cambodia, and so forth. But I think that on a bottom line basis, if you look at the Vietnam Agreement, if you look at the opening to China, if you look at the détente that he did with the Soviet Union, if you look at the withdrawal agreements that he negotiated between Sadat and Golda Meir, that he was a great diplomat with a great vision of the world.
I think we have time for one more question. So
Yeah,
you
hi.
get to go.
Yeah, I wonder if you'd care to comment on the long-term effects of WikiLeaks on American diplomacy, and in particular, how it might affect back channels.
So this is really a good question, and it's actually one of the questions that Becca had enlisted for me to look at, and that is the role of social media in negotiations. Negotiations succeed, if they're going to be successful at all, if they're done quietly, if they're done out of the public eye. I mean, the reason why President Carter chose Camp David and barred the press from coming was because if it was held in a more public forum in Washington and Jerusalem and Cairo, there would have been an inevitable effort to leak to your home base where you were. And so you have to do these things out of sight and then hope that the negotiators are courageous enough to buck the opposition at home. Now, this is where the WikiLeaks and the social media come into play, because the incentive for misinformation. I mean, we see this with anti-Semitism. I mean, one of the things we're doing at the Holocaust Museum is we are spending special efforts down to 13-year-olds to counter misinformation about anti-Semitism and the Holocaust on social media. But you can imagine in a negotiation, you're in a sensitive negotiation, and suddenly WikiLeaks, not necessarily because of a leak from an actual negotiator, but some other person who wants it disrupted. And that spreads like a viral fire and makes it much more complicated for the negotiations to proceed. So it is a real challenge as we go into the digital and social media era, and one we're simply going to have to try to live with. But it's absolutely a very good question, and one that is, I think, a real barrier to success. And the other barrier is, again, and I really want to stress this, we're going to have our political differences. But, you know, Senator Vandenberg many decades ago said politics should end at the water's edge. And if we are as divided in our outlook on the world as we are internally, it weakens our negotiating stance. So That's why Tony Blinken at the end said what I put at the final paragraph of my book, which is strengthen ourselves economically, politically, militarily, but also try to end this awful polarization so that we try to speak with one voice when we're talking to other countries abroad. Thank you for coming. And
Thank you.
I'll be glad to sign your books.
Thank you. So if you would like, thank you so much for sharing your experience with us. Again, plug the book, The Art of Diplomacy. You can still buy it out.
I do want to tell you one funny story as we leave. I should have said this when we go to the question period, and that is, it's my favorite story from the Carter administration. There was a very famous, very influential senator named Russell Long from Louisiana. He was a chairman of the Senate Finance Committee, through which most of our legislation went. And he grew up in the governor's mansion as a young boy when Huey Long, the Kingfish, All the King's Men book, was the governor. And he was a real character. And Russell said the following happened. Palmer came home one night to the governor's mansion in Baton Rouge, just stone cold drunk, stumbled up the stairs, had a very shaky hand, and got the key and the keyhole to a latch, opened the door, and then collapsed in the foyer, only to see Mama, whose apron strings, he said, as a young boy I was holding, look down sternly at the floor for an explanation as to how this state of affairs could have happened to the great state, to the governor of great state of Louisiana. And he said, Papa said, Mama, I've completed my prepared remarks. I'll now take questions from the floor. So that's what I've been doing. Only with water, I can assure you.
Amazing. So if you have a copy of the book that you'd like to get signed, kind of make your way. We'll do a lineup over here.